Now, the first piece is from A String of Pearls, but it's not a scene involving a Sweeney Todd. But the book is so full of casual, gory murders, and I particularly liked this one. And this is a friend of Sweeney Todd's who lives in the flat above the chapel. And beneath the chapel, I don't know if anybody's ever read the whole book, beneath the chapel is a crypt, vaults, and that's actually where Sweeney Todd takes the bodies, and from there they go to the vaults beneath Mrs. Lovett's pie shop. But this is Mr. Lupin who lives, as I said, in the flat above the chapel, and he has the key to the vaults. There was a stunning knock at the door. "Who's there? Who's there?" inquired Lupin. "It's me, Groggs, and you know it," said a female voice. "Open the door, or I'll rouse the whole neighbourhood." "Come, you be off." "Ho, ho, ho. Why, Groggs, they'll find you out some day and limb you. If they only knew that you were Groggs, the returned transport, how they'd mob you, to be sure. But I've come for money, old fellow, and I'll have it. I ain't drunk, but I've had enough, just enough, Mark, me old boy, and you know what I'm capable of when that's the case. I'm your wife, and you know it. Ho, ho." "Confound you," said Lupin. "You always will come with your infernal demands at the very worst and most awkward times and seasons to me. Did you not take £10 some time ago and promise to come near me no more?" "Yes, I did, but I'm here again, you see. You thought I'd drink myself to death with that amount of money, and that you'd get rid of me, but it did me good. The good stuff did me good." "You're a fool," said Lupin. "I tell you, woman, you'll be my ruin, my absolute ruin. And then where will your supplies come from, I should like to know? Why, I've an idiot only in the next room, of whom I hope to make a good thing, and if you'd only come in 5 minutes sooner, you would have been heard by her, and I should have been done up here." "Why don't she hear you now? You cut her throat like you did the woman's by whopping." "Hush, hush, you devil! Why'd you allude to that?" "Because I like, my beauty, because I know you did it. Whenever I do mention it, the gallows shines out in your face as plain as this hand, and I like to see you quake and change colour, and be ready almost to fall down with your fears. I like that. Yes, it's as good to me as a drop of drink, that is." "I only wish your throat was cut, that's all." "I know you do, but you won't try that one upon me. Oh, no, 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 you won't try that on. Look at this, my beauty. Do you think I'd step into a place of yours without something in the shape of a friend with me? Oh, no, no." The lady exhibited the handle and point of the blade of a knife as she spoke, at which Mr. Lupin staggered back. "Listen to reason, Jane," he said. "You and I together might make a fortune quite easily. It's difficult to talk with you while you're in such a humour. Come, will you take something to drink?" "Do you think now that I'm such an idiot as to drain of anything in your place? Now, I'm not quite so green as that. Give me some money and I'll fetch something. And as long as I've got my hand on the bottle, where I will take good care to keep it, I shall know that I'm safe from you, but not otherwise." "Well, there's money, Jane, and there's an empty bottle. Go and get what you like for yourself. I'll let you in again, so you needn't be afraid of that, Jane." "Afraid? Afraid? It's a likely thing, indeed. I afraid of being kept out by you. How did I get in before, when you would have given one of your ears to keep me out? Why, by frightening you, of course, and I'll do it again. Give me hold of the bottle. I afraid of you, indeed. Likely thing." The lady left the room with the bottle and half a guinea in her hand. Lupin lighted her out and lingered till he heard her footsteps die away right up the dismal, dingy-looking court. Then the arch-hypocrite set the candlestick down upon the table with a force that nearly started the candle out of it, and then, in a fierce voice, he cried, "Done! She's done at last! Jane, you done at last! I kept that bottle for an emergency. Seemed empty, but smeared all around its inner side is a sufficient quantity of a powerful narcotic to affect the very devil himself if he were to drink anything that had been poured into it. You might think yourself clever, Jane, but you're done at last." In the course of about 5 minutes, a heavy single knock announced her return. "Brandy," she said. "I got brandy, and I mean to keep my hand on the bottle, I tell you." "I know you. No one knows you better than I do. You won't find it so very easy a thing to get the better of me. I'll keep my hand on the bottle." "How very suspicious you are," said Lupin. "It's quite distressing." "Is it? Well, have a drop, then I'll go. If you're civil to me whenever I choose to come, it'll be better for you. But I'm not the sort of person to stand any nonsense, I can assure you." "No, Jane, I never said you were," replied Lupin, "and I hope that tonight will see the beginning, as it were, of a kind of reconciliation and better feeling between us." The lady half drew the knife she had exhibited before from the bosom of her dress as she said, "Look at this. Look at this. I distrust you all the more when you talk as you do now, and I'll tell you that if I've any of your nonsense, I'll pretty soon settle you. You mean something. I know by the twinkle of your eye. I've watched you before, and I know you." "Oh, really, this is too bad," said Lupin, as he wiped his face with a remarkably old handkerchief. "This is too bad, Jane. If I'm kind and civil to you, that don't suit, and if I'm rough and rather stern, you fly out at that too. Will nothing please you?" "Ah!" said Jane. "Hold your nonsense. How much money am I to have when I've finished the brandy? That's the question now." "Will 3 guineas be enough, Jane, just for the present occasion?" "No, I must have 5, or if you don't produce them, I'll make you." "Oh, you shall have them, Jane. But won't you give me a drop of the brandy? You don't mean to take it all?" "Yes, I do. It's only half a pint, and what's that? You can drink some of what you said you had in the place. I didn't go out to buy for you. Besides, I won't trust it in a moment out of my hands. You'd put something in it before I could wink." Really, what a strange woman. But you won't have a glass, Jane, to drink out of? Let me get you a glass now." No, you'd put something in that too. Oh, I'm up to your tricks, I am, old boy. You won't get the better of me. Very good brandy it is too. Jane took a hearty pull at the bottle, so hearty a one that 2/3 of the mixture vanished, and then, with her hand on the neck of it, she sat glaring at Lupin, who was on the opposite side of the table, with an awfully satanic grin upon his ugly features. "Has an odd taste." "An odd taste!" cried Lupin. "It's a capital thing that you brought it yourself and kept your hand over the bottle. I'm very glad of that, old woman." "But I feel odd. I ain't the thing. I don't feel very well, Lupin." "I feel as if I were dying. I don't see things very clearly. I'm ill. Oh, what's this? Something's amiss. Mercy, mercy!" "I shall fall. Help, the room swims round me. I'm poisoned, I know I am. Mercy, help, murder, oh, spare me." Lupin rose and went round the table. He caught hold of the wretched woman by the head, and applying his mouth close to her ear, he said, "Jane, there was something in the bottle, and I intend to cut your throat. Hope the knife you've got with you has a good edge to it." She tried to scream, but only an indistinct, strange, stifled cry came from her lips. She tried to get up, but her limbs refused their office. The powerful narcotic had taken effect, and she fell forward, her head striking the table heavily, upsetting the bottle with the remainder of the drugged brandy in it as she did so. "Done," said Lupin. "Done at last. Oh, how I've watched for such an opportunity as this. How often I've pleased myself with the idea of meeting her in some lonely place when she was off her guard and killing her. But I never thought that anything could happen half so lucky as this. Let me think. I'm quite alone in this building, or as good as alone. I can easily drag the dead body downstairs and place it in one of the vaults under the chapel, to which I have the key. I'll wrench open some coffin, if that be all, and cram her in on the top of the dead there previously. That will do. And then I defy any circumstances to find me out. How safe a death this would be, to be sure. How very, very safe." Lupin disappeared for a few seconds into a room where he usually slept. From thence he returned with a wash-hand basin in his hand, which he placed upon the floor. He then fumbled about the clothing of his wife until he found the knife that she had twice so threateningly exhibited to him. He held it up to the light and narrowly scrutinized it. "I will do, I think," he said. He tried its keenness on the edge of the sole of his shoe, and he was satisfied that it had been well prepared for mischief. "It will do well," he said. "Well, nothing can be better. From this night I shall be free from the fears that have haunted me night and day for so long. This woman's the only person in all London who really knows me and who has it in her power to destroy all my prospects. When she's gone, I shall be perfectly easy and safe, and surely never was such a deed as this done with so much positive safety." Lupin twined his left hand in the hair at the back of the head of the wretched woman, and then he held her head over the wash-hand basin. There was a bright flash of the knife, and then a gushing, gurgling sound, and blood poured into the basin, hot, hissing, and frothing. The light fell upon the face of Lupin, and at that time so changed was it that one might not have recognised it, and might have doubted if some devil had not risen up through the floor to do the deed of blood. He dropped the knife to the floor. The murdered woman made a faint movement with her arms, and then all was over. The blood still rolled forth and filled the wash-hand basin. Lupin caught the cover from the table, throwing everything that was upon it to the floor, and wrapped it many times round the head, face, and neck of his victim. "It is done," he said. "It is done." He still held the body by the hair of the head, and dragging it along the floor, he dropped it near the door opening onto the staircase. He then went to a cupboard in the room, and finding a bottle, he plunged the neck of it into his mouth and drank deeply. The draught was ardent spirit, but it had no more effect on him at that moment than as though it had been so much water from a spring. That is to say, it had no intoxicating effect. It may have stilled some of the emotions of dread and horror which his own crime must have called up from the bottom even of such a heart as his. He was human, and he could not be utterly callous. Leaning against the cupboard door for a few seconds, he gasped out, "Yes, it is done, it is quite done, and now for the worst, now for the body and the vaults and the dead. Can I do it? Can I do it? I must. Yes, I must. There's no safety for me if I do not. I shall come else to the scaffold. I think already that I see the hooting crowd, the rope and the crossbeam. Now they hold my arms. Now they tell me to call upon God for mercy to my wretched blood-stained soul. Now the mob shouts. The hangman touches me. I feel the rope around my neck. They draw the cap over my face and so shut out the world from me forever. I die. I struggle, I writhe, I faint. God, God, God help me." He fell heavily to the floor of the room. Dorian, cried Basil Hallward, English society's all wrong. That is the reason why I want you to be fine. You've not been fine. One has a right to judge of a man by the effect he has over his friends. You seem to lose all sense of honour, of goodness, of purity. You fill them with a madness for pleasure. They've gone down into the depths. You led them there. Yes, you led them there, and yet you can smile as you're smiling now. You have a wonderful influence. Let it be for good, not for evil. They say that you corrupt everyone with whom you become intimate, and that it's quite sufficient for you to enter a house for shame of some kind to follow after. I don't know whether it's so or not. I wonder, do I know you? Before I could answer that, I should have to see your soul. To see my soul, muttered Dorian Gray, starting up from the sofa and turning almost white from fear. Yes, answered Hallward gravely, and with deep-toned sorrow in his voice. To see your soul. But only God can do that. A bitter laugh of mockery broke from the lips of the younger man. You shall see it tonight, he cried, seizing a lamp from the table. Come, it's your own handiwork. Why shouldn't you look at it? You can tell the world all about it afterwards if you choose. Nobody would believe you. If they did believe you, then they would like me all the better for it. I know the age better than you do, though you will prate about it so tediously. Come, I tell you, you've chattered enough about corruption. Now you shall look on it face to face. There was the madness of pride in every word he uttered. He stamped his foot on the ground in his boyish, insolent manner. He felt a terrible joy at the thought that someone else was to share his secret, and that the man who had painted the portrait that was the origin of all his shame was to be burdened for the rest of his life with the hideous memory of what he had done. Yes, he continued, coming closer to him and looking steadfastly into his stern eyes, I shall show you my soul. You shall see the very thing you fancy only God can see. Hallward started back. This is blasphemy, Dorian, he cried. You think so? Dorian Gray smiled. There was a curl of contempt in his lips. Come upstairs, Basil, he said quietly. I keep a diary of my life from day to day, and it never leaves the room in which it is written. I shall show it to you if you will come with me. Oh, I shall come with you, Dorian, if you wish it, but don't ask me to read anything tonight. All I want is a plain answer to my question. That shall be given to you upstairs. I could not give it here. You will not have to read long. They passed out of the room and began the ascent, walking softly as men do instinctively at night. The lamp cast fantastic shadows on the wall and staircase. A rising wind made some of the windows rattle. When they reached the top landing, Dorian set the lamp down on the floor and, taking out the key, turned it in the lock. You insist on knowing, Basil? He asked in a low voice. Yes. I'm delighted, he answered, smiling. Then he added, somewhat harshly, You're the one man in the world who's entitled to know everything about me. You've had more to do with my life than you think. And taking up the lamp, he opened the door and went in. A cold current of air passed them, and the light shot up for a moment in a flame of murky orange. He shuddered. Shut the door behind you, he whispered, as he placed the lamp on the table. Hallward glanced around him with a puzzled expression. The room looked as if it had not been lived in for years. As Dorian Gray was lighting a half-burned candle that was standing on the mantel-shelf, he saw that the whole place was covered with dust and the carpet was in holes. A mouse ran scuffling behind the wainscoting. There was a damp odour of mildew. So you think it's only God who sees the soul, Basil? Draw that curtain back and you will see mine. The voice that spoke was cold and cruel. He tore the curtain from its rod and flung it on the ground. An exclamation of horror broke from the painter's lips as he saw in the dim light the hideous face on the canvas grinning at him. There was something in its expression that filled him with disgust and loathing, Good heavens, it was Dorian Gray's own face that he was looking at. The horror, whatever it was, had not yet entirely spoiled that marvellous beauty. There was still some gold in the thinning hair and some scarlet on the sensual mouth. The sodden eyes had kept something of the loveliness in their blue. The noble curves had not yet completely passed away from chiselled nostrils and from plastic throat. Yes, it was Dorian himself. But who had done it? He seemed to recognise his own brushstroke, and the frame was his own design. The idea was monstrous, yet he felt afraid. He seized the lighted candle and held it to the picture. In the left-hand corner was his own name, traced in long letters of bright vermilion. It was some foul parody, some infamous, ignoble satire. He had never done that. Still, it was his own picture. He knew it, and he felt as if his blood had changed in a moment from fire to sluggish ice. His own picture. What did it mean? Why had it altered? He turned and looked at Dorian Gray with the eyes of a sick man. His mouth twitched and his parched tongue seemed unable to articulate. He passed his hand across his forehead. It was dank with clammy sweat. The young man was leaning against the mantelshelf, watching him with that strange expression that one sees on the faces of those who are absorbed in a play when some great artist is acting. There was neither real sorrow in it, nor real joy. There was simply the passion of the spectator, with perhaps a flicker of triumph in his eyes. He had taken the flower out of his coat and was smelling it, or pretending to do so. "What does this mean?" cried Hallward at last. His own voice sounded shrill and curious in his ears. "Years ago, when I was a boy," said Dorian Gray, crushing the flower in his hand, "you met me, flattered me, and taught me to be vain of my good looks. One day you introduced me to a friend of yours who explained to me the wonder of youth, and you finished a portrait of me that revealed to me the wonder of beauty. In a mad moment that even now I don't know whether I regret or not, I made a wish. Perhaps you could call it a prayer." "I remember it. Well, I remember it. No, the thing's impossible. The room's damp. Mildew's got into the canvas. The paints I used had some wretched mineral poison in them. I tell you, the thing's impossible." "Ah, what is impossible?" murmured the young man, going over to the window and leaning his forehead against the cold, mist-stained glass. "Oh, you told me you destroyed it." "I was wrong. It has destroyed me." "I don't believe it's my picture. This is the face of a satyr." "It's the face of my soul." "Christ, what a thing I must have worshipped! It has the eyes of a devil." "Each of us has heaven and hell in him, Basil," cried Dorian with a wild gesture of despair. Hallward turned again to the portrait and gazed at it. "My God! If it is true," he exclaimed, "and this is what you have done with your life, why, you must be worse. Even those who talk against you fancy you to be." He held the light up against the canvas again and examined it. The surface seemed to be quite undisturbed, and as he'd left it. It was from within, apparently, that the foulness and horror had come. Through some strange quickening of inner life, the leprosies of sin were slowly eating the thing away. The rotting of a corpse in a watery grave was not so fearful. His hand shook, and the candle fell from its socket on the floor and lay there sputtering. He placed his foot on it and put it out. Then he flung himself into the rickety chair that was standing by the table and buried his face in his hands. Good God, Dorian, what a lesson! What an awful lesson! There was no answer, but he could hear the young man sobbing at the window. "Pray, Dorian, pray," he murmured. "What is it that
one was taught to say in one's boyhood. Lead us not into temptation, forgive us our sins, wash away our iniquities. Let's say that together. The prayer of your pride has been answered. The prayer of your repentance will be answered also. Dorian Gray turned slowly around and looked at him with tear-dimmed eyes. It's too late, Basil, he faltered. It's never too late, Dorian. Let us kneel down and try if we cannot remember a prayer. Isn't there a verse somewhere? Though your sins be as scarlet, yet I will make them as white as snow. Those words mean nothing to me now. Hush, don't say that. You've done enough evil in your life. Good God, don't you see that accursed thing leering at us? Dorian Gray glanced at the picture and suddenly an uncontrollable feeling of hatred for Basil Hallward came over him, as though it had been suggested to him by the image on the canvas, whispered into his ear by those grinning lips. The mad passions of a hunted animal stirred within him, and he loathed the man who was seated at the table. Something glimmered on the top of the painted chest that faced him. His eye fell on it. He knew what it was. It was a knife. He moved slowly towards it, passing Hallward as he did so. As soon as he got behind him, he seized it and turned round. Hallward, sitting in his chair, as if he was going to rise, stirred. He rushed at him and he dug the knife into the great vein that's behind the ear, crushing the man's head down on the table and stabbing again and again. There was a stifled groan and the horrible sound of someone choking with blood. 3 times the outstretched arms shot up convulsively, waving grotesquely, stiff-fingered hands in the air. He stabbed him twice more, but the man did not move. Something began to trickle on the floor. He waited for a moment, still pressing the head down. Then he threw the knife on the table and listened. He could hear nothing but the drip, drip on the threadbare carpet. He opened the door and went out onto the landing. The house was absolutely quiet. No one was about. For a few seconds he stood bending over the balustrade and peering down into the black, seething well of darkness. Then he took out the key and returned to the room, locking himself in as he did so. The thing was still seated in the chair, straining over the table with bowed head and humped back, and long, fantastic arms. Had it not been for the red, jagged tear in the neck and the clotted black pool that was slowly widening on the table, one would have said that the man was simply asleep. How quickly it had all been done. He felt strangely calm, and walking over to the window, opened it and stepped out onto the balcony. The wind had blown the fog away, and the sky was like a monstrous peacock's tail, starred with myriads of golden eyes. A bitter blast swept across the square. The gas lamps flickered and became blue, and the leafless trees shook their black iron branches to and fro. He shivered and went back, closing the window behind him. He could not help seeing the dead thing. How still it was, how horribly white the long hands looked. It was like a dreadful wax image. Having locked the door behind him, he crept quietly downwards. The woodwork creaked and seemed to cry out as if in pain. He stopped several times and waited. No, everything was still. It was merely the sound of his own footsteps. In the past, in the early days of the world, there were monsters who were so vast that they could exist for thousands of years. Some of them must have overlapped the Christian era. They may have progressed intellectually in process of time. If they had in any way so progressed, or even got the most rudimentary form of brain, they would be the most dangerous things that ever were in the world. Tradition says that one of these monsters lived in the marsh of the east and came up to a cave in Diana's Grove, which was also called the lair of the white worm. Such creatures may have grown down as well as up. They may have grown into, or something like, human beings. Lady Arabella March is of snake nature. She has committed crimes to our knowledge. She retains something of the vast strength of her primal being can see in the dark, as the eyes of a snake. Without, the clouds grew thicker and blacker as the storm centre came closer. As yet the forces from whose linking the lightning springs were held apart, and the silence of nature proclaimed the calm before the storm. Caswell felt the effect of the gathering electric force. A sort of wild exultation grew upon him, such as he had sometimes felt just before the breaking of a tropical storm. As he became conscious of this, he raised his head and caught sight of Mimi. He moved to the door to the turret stair by which the roof was reached, and spoke in a tone that made her feel defiant. "Come, I want you." Mimi instantly drew back. "Why should I go? What for?" "I want you, if you will be so good, to come with me to the turret roof. I am much interested in certain experiments with the kite, which would be, if not a pleasure, at least a novel experience to you. You would see something not easily seen otherwise." She did not like to be left alone at such a height, in such a place, in the darkness, with a storm about to break. Of himself she had no fear, and when he put out a hand to guide her to the steep, narrow stairway, she took it without thought. Lady Arabella, crouching in the lobby behind the door, heard every word that had been said and formed her own opinion of it. It seemed evident to her that there had been some rapprochement between the two, who had so lately been hostile to each other, and that made her furiously angry. Mimi was interfering with her plans. She had made certain of her capture of Edgar Caswell, and she could not tolerate even the lightest fancy on his part that might divert him from the main issue. When she became aware that he wished Mimi to come with him to the roof, and that she had acquiesced, her rage got beyond bounds. She became oblivious to any danger there might be in a visit to such an exposed place at such a time, and to all lesser considerations, and made up her mind to forestall them. She stealthily and noiselessly crept through the wicket and ascended the stair, stepping out on the roof. It was bitterly cold, for the fierce gusts of the storm which swept round the turret drove in through every unimpeded way, whistling at the sharp corners and singing through the trembling flagstaff. The kite string and the wire which controlled the runners made a concourse of weird sounds which somehow, perhaps from the violence that surrounded them acting on their length, resolved them into some kind of harmony, a fitting accompaniment to the tragedy which seemed about to begin. Mimi's heart beat heavily. Just before leaving the turret chamber, she had a shock which she could not shake off. The lights of the room had momentarily revealed to her, as they passed out, Edgar's face, concentrated, as it was whenever he intended to use his mesmeric power. Now the black eyebrows made a thick line across his face, under which his eyes shone and glittered ominously. The sky was now somewhat lighter than it had been. Either there was lightning afar off, whose reflections were carried by the rolling clouds, or else the gathered force, though not yet breaking into lightning, had an incipient power of light. It seemed to affect both the man and the woman. Edgar seemed altogether under its influence. His spirits were boisterous, his mind exalted. Mimi, trying to keep as far as him from possible, moved across the stone floor of the turret roof and found a niche which concealed her. It was not far from Lady Arabella's place of hiding. Edgar left thus alone on the centre of the turret roof, found himself altogether his own master in a way which tended to increase his madness. He knew that Mimi was close at hand, though he had lost sight of her. He spoke loudly, and the sound of his own voice, though it was carried from him on the sweeping wind as fast as the words were spoken, seemed to exalt him still more. Even the raging of the elements round him appeared to add to his exaltation. To him it seemed that these manifestations were obedient to his own will. He had reached the sublime of his madness. He was now, in his own mind, actually the Almighty, and whatever might happen would be the direct carrying out of his own commands. As he could not see Mimi nor fix whereabouts she was, he shouted loudly, "Come to me! You shall see now what you are despising, what you are warring against. All that you see is mine, the darkness as well as the light. I tell you that I am greater than any other who is, or was, or shall be. When the master of evil took Christ up on a high place and showed him all the kingdoms of the earth, he was doing what he thought no other could do. Where he was wrong, he forgot me. I shall send you light up to the very ramparts of heaven, a light so great that it shall dissipate those black clouds that are rushing up and piling around us. Look, look, at the very touch of my hand that light springs into being and mounts up and up and up." He made his way, whilst he was speaking, to the corner of the turret whence flew the great kite and from which the runners ascended. Mimi looked on, appalled and afraid to speak, lest she should precipitate some calamity. Within the niche, Lady Arabella cowered in a paroxysm of fear. Edgar took up a small wooden box through a hole in which the wire of the runner ran. This evidently set some machinery in motion, for a sound as of whirring came. From one side of the box floated what looked like a piece of stiff ribbon, which snapped and crackled as the wind took it. For a few moments Mimi saw it as it rushed along the sagging line to the kite. When close to it there was a loud crack, and a sudden light appeared to issue from every chink in the box. Then a quick flame flashed along the snapping ribbon, which glowed with an intense light, a light so great that the whole of the countryside around stood out against the background of black, driving clouds. For a few seconds the light remained, then it suddenly disappeared in the blackness around. It was simply a magnesium light which had been fired by the mechanism within the box and carried up to the kite. Edgar was in a state of tumultuous excitement, shouting and yelling at the top of his voice and dancing about like a lunatic. This was more than Lady Arabella's dual nature could stand. The ghoulish element in her rose triumphant, and she abandoned all idea of marriage with Edward Caswell, gloating feverishly over the thought of revenge. She must lure him to the white worm's hole. But how? She glanced around and quickly made up her mind. The man's whole thoughts were absorbed by his wonderful kite, which he was showing off in order to fascinate her imaginary rival, Mimi. On the instant she glided through the darkness to the wheel, whereon the string of the kite was wound. With deft fingers she unshipped this, took it with her, reeling out the wire as she went, thus keeping in a way in touch with the kite. Then she glided swiftly to the wicket through which she passed, locking the gate behind her as she went. Down the turret stair she ran quickly, letting the wire run from the wheel, which she carried carefully, and passing out of the hall door, hurried down the avenue with all speed. She soon reached her own gate, ran down the avenue, and with her key opened the iron door leading to the well-hole. She felt well satisfied with herself. All her plans were maturing, or had already matured. The master of Castra Regis was within her grasp. She tore off her clothes with feverish fingers, and in full enjoyment of her natural freedom, stretched her slim figure in animal delight. Then she lay down on the sofa to await her victim. Edgar Caswell's lifeblood would more than satisfy her for some time to come. We move on a few hours to here. In the meantime, dynamite has been placed within the well of the white worm in its lair. because they have to rid themselves of this monster. And it's been filled with sand. At the gate of Castra Regis, the sultans were extra careful. When drawing near, Adam stumbled upon the wire that Lady Arabella had left trailing on the ground. I don't want to frighten you, Mimi dear, but this is the track where the lightning will go. At any moment, even now, whilst we are speaking and searching, a fearful force may be loosed upon us. They picked up the trail of the wire on the steps and followed it down the avenue, taking care not to touch it with their feet. It was easy enough to follow, for the wire, if not bright, was self-coloured and showed clearly. They followed it out of the gateway and into the avenue of Diana's Grove. Whilst they were standing there, there came a blinding flash of lightning which lit up for several seconds the whole area of earth and sky. It was only the first note of the celestial prelude, for it was followed in quick succession by numerous flashes, whilst the crash and roll of thunder seemed continuous. Adam drew his wife to him and held her close. As far as he could estimate by the interval between lightning and thunderclap, the heart of the storm was still some distance off, so he felt no present concern for their safety. Still, it was apparent that the course of the storm was moving swiftly in their direction. The lightning flashes came faster and faster and closer together, the thunder roll not stopping for a moment, a new crash beginning before the old one had ceased. Adam kept looking up in the direction of where the kite was strained and struggling at its detaining core, but of course the dull evening light prevented any distinct scrutiny. At length there was a flash so appallingly bright that in its glare nature seemed to be standing still. So long did it last that there was time to distinguish its configuration. It seemed like a mighty tree, inverted, pendant from the sky. The whole country abroad within the angle of vision was lit up till it seemed to glow. Then a broad ribbon of fire seemed to drop onto the tower of Castra Regis just as the thunder crashed. By the glare, Adam could see the tower shake and tremble, and finally fall to pieces like a house of cards. The passing of the lightning left the sky again dark, but a blue flame fell downward from the tower, and with inconceivable rapidity, running along the ground in the direction of Diana's Grove, reached the dark, silent house, which, in the instant, burst into flame at 100 different points. At the same moment there rose from the house a rending, crashing sound of woodwork broken or thrown about, mixed with a quick scream so appalling that Adam, stout of heart as he undoubtedly was, felt his blood turn into ice. Instinctively, despite the danger and their consciousness of it, husband and wife took hands and listened, trembling. Something was going on close to them, mysterious, terrible, deadly. The shrieks continued, though less sharp in sound, as though muffled. In the midst of them, there was a terrific explosion, seeming from deep in the earth. The flames from Castra Regis and from Diana's Grove made all around almost as light as day, and now that the lightning had ceased to flash, their eyes unblinded were able to judge both perspective and detail. The heat of the burning house caused the iron doors to warp and collapse. Seemingly of their own accord, they fell open and exposed the interior. The sultans could now look through to the room beyond, where the well-hole yawned, a deep, narrow, circular chasm. From this, the agonized shrieks were rising, growing ever more terrible with each second that passed. But it was not only the heart-rending sound that almost paralyzed poor Mimi with terror. What she saw was sufficient to fill her with evil dreams for the remainder of her life. The whole place looked as if a sea of blood had been beaten against it. Each of the explosions from below had thrown out from the well hole, as if it had been the mouth of a cannon, a mass of fine sand mixed with blood, and a horrible, repulsive slime in which there were great masses of rent and torn flesh and fat. As the explosions kept on, more and more of this repulsive mass was shot up, the great bulk of it falling back again. Many of the awful fragments were of something which had lately been alive. They quivered and trembled and writhed as though they were still in torment, a supposition to which the unending scream gave a horrible credence. At moments, some mountainous mass of flesh surged up through the narrow orifice, as though forced by a measureless power through an opening infinitely smaller than itself. Some of these fragments were partially covered with white skin, as of a human being, and others, the largest and most numerous, were scaled skin, as of a gigantic lizard or serpent. Once, in a sort of lull or pause, the seething contents of the whole rose after the manner of a bubbling spring, and Adam saw part of the thin form of Lady Arabella forced up to the top, amid a mass of blood and slime, and what looked as if it had been the entrails of a monster torn into shreds. Several times some masses of enormous bulk were forced up through the well hole with inconceivable violence, and suddenly expanding as they came into larger space, disclosed sections of the white worm which Adam and Sir Nathaniel had been looking over the trees at, with its enormous eyes of emerald green, flickering like great lamps in a gale. At last, the explosive power, which not yet exhausted, evidently reached the main store of dynamite which had been lowered into the wormhole. The result was appalling. The ground for far around quivered and opened into long, deep chasms whose edges shook and fell in, throwing up clouds of sand which fell back and hissed among the rising water. The heavy-built house shook to its foundations. Great stones were thrown up as from a volcano, some of them great masses of hard stone, squared and grooved with implements wrought by human hands, breaking up and splitting in mid-air as though riven by some infernal power. Trees near the house, and therefore presumably in some way above the hole, which sent up clouds of dust and steam and fine sand mingled, and which carried an appalling stench which sickened the spectators, were torn up by the roots and hurled into the air. By now flames were bursting violently from all over the ruins, so dangerously that Adam caught up his wife in his arms and ran with her from the proximity of the flames. Then, almost as quickly as it had begun, the whole cataclysm ceased, though a deep down rumbling continued intermittently for some time. The silence brooded over all, a silence so complete that it seemed in itself a sentient thing, silence which seemed like incarnate darkness, and conveyed the same idea to all who came within its radius. To the young people who had suffered the long horror of that awful night, it brought relief. Relief from the presence or the fear of all that was horrible. Relief which seemed perfected when the red rays of sunrise shot up over the far eastern sea, bringing a promise of a new order of things with the coming day.
Augustus Snipes, sir, at your service. Brought home the clothes, sir. The full dress suit you were so good as to order to be ready today, sir. Oh, are you a tailor? Oh, dear no, sir, we're not tailors nowadays, we're artists. Of course you are, whatever you are, I don't care. Some artist, I'm afraid, has done me out of £8,000. Oh, dear. Put down the things. What do they come to? £18, 10 shillings and threepence, sir. John Mundell gave a deep groan, and the tailor brushed past Todd to place the clothes upon a side table. As he returned, he caught sight of Todd's face, and in an instant his face lighted up, and he cried, "Oh, how do? How do?" "Eh?" said Todd. "How did the pompadour-coloured coat and the velvet smalls do, eh? Fit well? Lord, what a rum start for a barber to have a suit of clothes fit for a duke." "Duke!" cried Mundell. Todd lifted one of his huge feet and gave the artist a kick that sent him sprawling to the door of the room.
"That," he said, "would teach you to make game of a poor man with a large family, you scoundrel." "What, you won't go, won't you? That—" The artist shot out of the door like lightning and flew down the stairs as though the devil himself was at his heels. Todd carefully closed the door again and fastened it by the little bolt. A strange expression was upon the countenance of John Mundell. His face looked perfectly convulsed, and he slowly rose from his chair. Todd placed one of his huge hands upon his breast and pushed him back again. "What's the matter?" said Todd.
He knows you."
"Well?"
"The pompadour-coloured coat. Ah, I recollect the pompadour-coloured coat, too. I thought I knew your face. There was a something, too, about your voice that haunted me like the remembrance of a dream. You are—"
"What?"
Help, tell me if I be mad, or if you are a duke in the disguise of a barber, or a barber in the likeness of a duke. Ah, that pompadour-coloured coat, it sticks in my throat."
"I wish it did," growled Todd. "What do you mean, Mr. Mundell? Pray express yourself. What do you mean by these incoherent expressions?"
"Are you human?"
"Dear me, I hope so. Really, sir, you look quite wild."
Stop. Let me think. The face, the voice, the pompadour coat, the costume fit for a duke. It must be so. Man or devil, I will grapple with you, for you have got my pearls and my money, my £8,000, my gold that I have lived, that I've toiled for, that I have schemed and cheated to keep up, that I have shut my eyes to all sights for, and my heart to all tender emotions. You have my money, and I will denounce you."
"Stop," said Todd. The usurer paused in what he was saying, but he still glared at Todd fiercely, and his eyes protruded from their orbits, while the muscles of his mouth worked as though he was still trying to utter audible sounds, but by some power was denied the capacity to utter them. "You say you've lost pearls?"
Yes, Orient pearls."
Todd dived his hand into the breast of his apparel and produced the string of pearls. He held them before the ravished and dazzled eyes of John Mundell, and he said, "Were they like these?" With a cry of joy, Mundell grasped at the pearls, tears of gratified avarice gushing from his eyes.
My own pearls, my beautiful pearls. Oh, blessed chance, my pearls back again. Ha, ha, ha."
"Ha!" echoed Todd, as he stepped behind the chair on which John Mundell was sitting. With his left hand he took one vigorous grasp of the remaining hair on the head of the usurer and forced his back against the chair. In another instant there was a sickening, gushing sound. Todd, with the razor he held in his right hand, had nearly cut John Mundell's head off. Then he held him still by the hair. "Gasp, gasp, gasp, bubble, gasp, bubble, goggle, goggle." A slight convulsive movement of the lashes, and the eyes set and became opaquely dim. The warm blood still bubbled, but John Mundell was dead. Todd picked up the pearls and carefully replaced them in his bosom again. "How many strange events," he said, "hang upon these baubles. It's only one more. A dirty job rather, but business is business." He stood in the room as silent as a statue and listened intensely. Not the slightest sound indicative of the proximity of anyone came upon his ears. He felt quite convinced that the deed of blood had been done in perfect secrecy. But then there he was. Who but he could be accused? There he stood, the self-convicted murderer. Had he not done the deed with the weapon of his handicraft that he had brought to the house? How was Todd to escape the seeming inevitable cold-blooded murder? We shall see. Huddled up in the chair was the dead body. Mundell had not fallen out of the capacious, easy seat in which he sat when he breathed his last. The blood rolled to the floor where it lay in a steaming mass. Todd was careful, very careful, not to tread in it. And he looked down to his garments to see if there were any telltale spots of gore, but standing behind the chair to do the deed as he had done, he'd been saved from anything of the sort. There he stood, externally spotless, like many a seeming and smirking sinner in this world. But oh, how black and stained within. Said Todd. John Mundell was half distracted by a heavy loss. He was ill, and his mind was evidently affected. He couldn't even shave himself. Oh, it's quite evident that John Mundell, unable to bear his miseries, real or ideal, any longer, in a fit of partial insanity, cut his throat. Yes, that will do. Todd still kept the razor in his grasp. What is he going to do? Murder again the murdered? Is he afraid that a man with 20 murders on his head will jostle him from his perilous pinnacle of guilty safety? No. He takes one of the clammy dead hands in his own. He clasps the half-rigid fingers over the handle of the razor, and then he holds them until, in the course of a minute or so, they've assumed the grasp he wishes, and the razor with which he, Todd, did the deed of blood, is held listlessly, but most significantly, in the hand of the dead. That will do, said Todd. The door is reached and unfastened, and the barber slips out of the room. He closes the door again upon the fetid, hot aroma of the blood that is there, fresh from the veins of a human being like himself. No, not like himself. No one can be like Sweeney Todd. He is a being of his own species, distinct, alone, an incarnation of evil. Morning of 16 May. God preserve my sanity, for to this I am reduced. Safety and the assurance of safety are things of the past. Whilst I live on here, there is but one thing to hope for, that I may not go mad, if indeed I be not mad already. If I be sane, then surely 'tis maddening to think that of all the foul things that lurk in this hateful place, the Count is the least dreadful to me, that to him alone I can look for safety, even though this be only whilst I can serve his purpose. Great God, merciful God, let me be calm, for out of that way lies madness indeed. I begin to get new light on certain things which have puzzled me. Up to now, I never quite knew what Shakespeare meant when he made Hamlet say, "My tablets, quick, my tablets, 'tis meet that I put it down," etc. For now, feeling as though my own brain was unhinged, or as if the shock had come which must end in its undoing, I turned to my diary for repose. The habit of entering accurately must help to soothe me. The Count's mysterious warning frightened me at the time. It frightens me more now when I think of it, for in future he has a fearful hold upon me. I shall fear to doubt what he may say. When I'd written in my diary and had fortunately placed the book and pen in my pocket, I felt sleepy. The Count's warning came into my mind, but I took a pleasure in disobeying it. The sense of sleep was upon me, and with it the obstinacy which sleep brings as outrider. The soft moonlight soothed, and the wide expanse without gave a sense of freedom which refreshed me. I determined not to return tonight to the gloom-haunted rooms, but to sleep here, where of old ladies had sat and sung and lived sweet lives, whilst their gentle breasts were sad for their menfolk, away in the midst of remorseless wars. I drew a great couch out of its place near the corner, so that, as I lay, I could look at the lovely view to east and south, and, unthinking of and caring for the dust, compose myself asleep. I suppose I must have fallen asleep. I hope so. But I fear, for all that followed was startlingly real, so real that now, sitting here in the broad full sunlight of the morning, I cannot, in the least, believe that it was all sleep. I was not alone. The room was the same, unchanged in any way since I had come into it. I could see along the floor in the brilliant moonlight my own footsteps marked where I had disturbed the long accumulation of dust. And the moonlight opposite me were 3 young women, ladies by their dress and manner. I thought at the time that I must be dreaming when I saw them, for though the moonlight was behind them, they threw no shadow on the floor. They came close to me and looked at me for some time, and they whispered together. 2 were dark and had high aquiline noses like the Count, and great dark piercing eyes that seemed to be almost red when contrasted with the pale yellow moon. The other was fair, as fair as can be, with great wavy masses of golden hair and eyes like pale sapphires. I seemed somehow to know her face, and to know it in connection with some dreamy fear, but I could not recollect at the moment how or where. All 3 had brilliant white teeth that shone like pearls against the ruby of their voluptuous lips. There was something about them that made me uneasy, some longing and, at the same time, some deadly fear. I felt in my heart a wicked, burning desire that they would kiss me with those red lips. It's not good to note this down, lest some day it should meet Mina's eyes and cause her pain, but it's the truth. They whispered together, and then all 3 laughed, such a silvery, musical laugh, but as hard as though the sound never could have come through the softness of human lips. It was like the intolerable, tingling sweetness of water glasses when played on by a cunning hand. The fair girl shook her head coquettishly, and the other 2 urged her on. One said, "Go on, you are first, then we shall follow. Yours is the right to begin." The other added, "He's young and strong, there are kisses for us all." I lay quiet, looking out under my eyelashes in an agony of delightful anticipation. The fair girl advanced and bent over me till I could feel the movement of her breath upon me. Sweet it was in one sense, honey sweet, and sent the same tingling through the nerves as her voice, but with bitter underlying the sweet, a bitter offensiveness, as one smells in blood. I was afraid to raise my eyelids, but looked out and saw perfectly under the lashes. The fair girl went on her knees and bent over me, fairly gloating. There was a deliberate voluptuousness which was both thrilling and repulsive, and as she arched her neck, she actually licked her lips like an animal, till I could see in the moonlight the moisture shining on the scarlet lips and on the red tongue as it lapped the white, sharp teeth. Lower and lower went her head as the lips went below the range of my mouth and chin and seemed about to fasten on my throat. Then she paused, and I could hear the churning sound of her tongue as it licked her teeth and lips. And I could feel the hot breath on my neck. Then the skin of my throat began to tingle as one's flesh does when the hand that is to tickle it approaches nearer, nearer. I could feel the soft shivering touch of the lips on the super-sensitive skin of my throat, and the hard dents of two sharp teeth just touching and pausing there. I closed my eyes in a languorous ecstasy and waited with beating heart. But at that instant, another sensation swept through me as quick as lightning. I was conscious of the presence of the Count and of his being as if lapped in a storm of fury. As my eyes opened involuntarily, I saw his strong hand grasp the slender neck of the fair woman and with giant's power draw it back. The blue eyes transformed with fury, the white teeth champing with rage, and the fair cheeks blazing red with passion. But the Count, never did I imagine such wrath and fury, even in the demons of the pit. His eyes were positively blazing. The red light in them was lurid, as if the flames of hellfire blazed behind them. His face was deathly pale, and the lines on it were hard, like drawn wires. The thick eyebrows that met over the nose now seemed like a heavy bar of white-hot metal. With a fierce sweep of his arm, he hurled the woman from him and then motioned to the others as though he were beating them back. It was the same imperious gesture I had seen used to the wolves, in a voice which, though low and almost a whisper, seemed to cut through the air and then ring around the room as he said, "How dare you touch them, any of you? You dare cast your eyes on him when I had forbidden it? Back, I tell you, this man belongs to me. Beware how you meddle with him, or you'll have to deal with me." The fair girl, with a laugh of ribald coquetry, turned to answer him. "You yourself never loved, you never love." On this the other women joined, and such a mirthless, hard, soulless laughter rang through the room that it almost made me faint to hear. It seemed like the pleasure of fiends. Then the Count turned, after looking at my face attentively, and said in a soft whisper, "Yes, I too can love. You yourselves can tell it from the past. Is it not so? Well, now I promise you that when I am done with him, you shall kiss him at your will. Now go, go. I must awaken him, for there is work to be done." "Are we to have nothing tonight?" said one of them with a low laugh as she pointed to the bag which she had thrown upon the floor and which moved as though there was some living thing within it. For answer he nodded his head. One of the women jumped forward and opened it. If my ears did not deceive me, there was a gasp and a low wail as of a half-smothered child. The women closed round while I was aghast with horror, but as I looked, they disappeared, and with them the dreadful bag. There was no door near them, and they could not have passed without my noticing. They simply seemed to fade into the rays of the moonlight and pass out through the window. I could see outside the dim, shadowy forms for a moment, before they entirely faded away. Then the horror overcame me and I sank down, unconscious. My last piece for tonight is by Elizabeth Gaskell. As I said, I was hard pushed to find something small, so again I did, as I've done with these others in fact. I picked a nice piece from Lois the Witch, which is about an English girl who loses her parents, and her mother's dying wish is for her to go and join her uncle and aunt in America. And we're talking about 1700s here. We're talking about the time of the Salem witch trials, because she actually arrives in Salem to live with her uncle and aunt. In fact, only her aunt, because her uncle dies. Her aunt and her cousins. and the hysteria of witchcraft, of being bewitched, takes hold of Salem. And poor old Lois, who's done nothing but be admired by the man whom her cousin was aiming to marry, is suddenly accused, amongst others, of witchcraft. It's from 1859 and was originally also published in instalments in All the Year Round, the journal that Charles Dickens curated. Lois was led before Mr. Haythorne and Mr. Kirwin, Justices of Salem, to be accused legally and publicly of witchcraft. Others were with her under the same charge, and when the prisoners were brought in, they were cried out at by the abhorrent crowd. The two Tappows, Prudence, and one or two other girls of the same age were there, in the characters of victims of the spells of the accused. The prisoners were placed about 7 or 8 feet from the justices, and the accusers between the justices and them. The former were then ordered to stand right before the justices. All this Lois did at their bidding, with something of the wondering docility of a child, but not without any hope of softening the hard, stony look of detestation that was on all the countenances around her, save those that were distorted by more passionate anger. Then an officer was bidden to hold each of her hands, and Justice Haythorne bade her keep her eyes continually fixed on him, lest, if she looked on Prudence, the girl might either fall into a fit or cry out that she was suddenly and violently hurt. They stood in silence 1 breathless minute. Then they were bidden to say the Lord's Prayer. As she had done alone in her cell the night before, Lois made a little pause before the prayer to be forgiven, as she forgave. At this instant of hesitation, as if they had been on the watch for it, they all cried out upon her for a witch, and when the clamour ended, the justices bade Prudence Hickson come forwards. Lois turned a little to one side, wishing to see at least one familiar face, but when her eyes fell upon Prudence, the girl stood stock still and answered no questions, nor spoke a word, and the justices declared she was struck dumb by witchcraft. Then some behind took Prudence under the arms and would have forced her forwards to touch Lois, probably esteeming that as a cure for her being bewitched. But Prudence had hardly been made to take 3 steps before she struggled out of their arms and fell down, writhing as if in a fit, calling out with shrieks and entreating Lois to help her and save her from her torment. Then all the girls began to tumble down like swine, to use the words of an eyewitness, and to cry out upon Lois and her fellow prisoners. These last were now ordered to stand with their hands stretched out, it being imagined that if the bodies of the witches were arranged in the form of a cross, they would lose their evil power. By and by Lois felt her strength going from the unwonted fatigue of such a position. The only way she could keep herself from utterly losing consciousness was by distracting herself from present pain and danger, and saying to herself verses of the Psalms as she could remember them. At length she was ordered back to jail, and dimly understood that she and others were sentenced to be hanged for witchcraft. Many people now looked eagerly at Lois to see if she would weep at this doom. If she'd had strength to cry, it was just possible that it might have been considered a plea in her favour, for witches could not shed tears, but she was too exhausted. All she wanted was to lie down once more on her prison bed, out of the reach of men's cries of abhorrence and out of the shot of their cruel eyes. So they led her back to prison, speechless and tearless. All night long she trembled and cried till morning came peering in through the square grating up above. It soothed her, and she fell into a heavy sleep, from which she was roused by Pastor Tappow and certain elders late on the morning of the following day. "Arise," said he, scrupled to touch her from his superstitious idea of her evil powers. "It is noonday." Where am I? Said she, bewildered at this unusual awakening and the array of severe faces all gazing upon her with reprobation. You are in Salem jail, condemned for a witch. Oh, alas, I had forgotten for an instant, said she, dropping her head upon her breast. She's been out on a devilish ride all night long, doubtless, and is weary and perplexed this morning, whispered one in so low a voice that he did not think she could hear, but she lifted up her eyes and looked at him with mute reproach. We are come, said Pastor Tapau, to exhort you to confess your great and manifold sin. My great and manifold sin, repeated Lois to herself, shaking her head. Yea, your sin of witchcraft. If you will confess, there may yet be balm in Gilead. One of the elders, struck with pity at the young girl's wan, shrunken look, said that if she confessed and repented and did penance, possibly her life might yet be spared. A sudden flash of light came into her sunk, dulled eye. Might she yet live? Was it yet in her power? Why, no one knew how soon her lover Ralph Lucy might be here to take her away for ever into the peace of a new home. Life! Oh, then all hope was not over. Perhaps she might still live and not die. Yet the truth came once more out of her lips, almost without any exercise of will. I am not a witch, she said. Then Pastor Tapau blindfolded her, all unresisting, but with languid wonder in her heart as to what was to come next. She heard people enter the dungeon softly and heard whispering voices. Then her hands were lifted up and made to touch someone near, and in an instant she heard a noise of struggling and the well-known voice of her cousin Prudence shrieking out in one of her hysterical fits, screaming to be taken away and out of that place. Some of the judges had evidently doubted of her guilt and demanded yet another test. Lois sat down heavily on the bed, thinking she must be in a horrible dream. So compassed about with dangers and enemies did she seem. Those in the dungeon, and by the oppression of the air she perceived that there were many, kept on eagerly talking in low voices. She did not try to make out the sense of the fragments of sentences that reached her dulled brain, till all at once a word or two made her understand that they were discussing the desirableness of applying the whip or the torture to make her confess and reveal by what means the spell she had cast upon those whom she had bewitched could be dissolved. A thrill of affright ran through her, and she cried out beseechingly, "Oh, I beg you, sirs, for God's mercy's sake, that you do not use such awful means. I may say anything, nay, I may accuse anyone if I am subjected to such torment as I've heard tell about. For I am but a young girl, and not very brave or very good as some are." It touched the hearts of one or two to see her standing there, the tears streaming down from below the coarse handkerchief bound tightly over her eyes, the clinking chain fastening the heavy weight to the slight ankle, the two hands held together as if to keep down a convulsive motion. "Look," said one of these, "she's weeping. They say no witch can weep tears." But another scoffed at this test, and bade the first to remember how even those of her own family, the Hicksons, bore witness against her. Once more she was bidden to confess. The charges, esteemed to have been proven, were read to her, with all the testimony borne against her in proof. They told her that, considering the godly family to which she belonged, the magistrates and ministers of Salem had decided that she should have her life spared if she would own her guilt, make reparation, and submit to penance. If not, she and others convicted of witchcraft along with her were to be hung in Salem marketplace on the next Thursday morning, Thursday being market day. They waited silently for her answer. It was a minute or two before she spoke. "May I have this handkerchief unbound from my eyes?" she asked. "For indeed, sirs, it hurts me." The occasion for which was blindfolded being over, the bandage was taken off. She looked pitifully at the stern faces around her in grim suspense as to what her answer would be. Then she spoke. "Sirs, I must choose death with a quiet conscience, rather than life to be gained by a lie. I'm not a witch. I know not hardly what you mean when you say I am. I've done many, many very wrong things in my life, but I think God will forgive me them for my Saviour's sake. Take not his name on your wicked lips, said Pastor Tapau, enraged at her resolution of not confessing, and scarcely able to keep himself from striking her. She saw the desire he had and shrank away in timid fear. Then Justice Haythorne solemnly read the legal condemnation of Lois Berkeley to death by hanging as a convicted witch. Then they left her to all the horrors of that solitary, loathsome dungeon and the strange terror of approaching death. Outside the prison walls, the dread of the witches and the excitement against witchcraft grew with fearful rapidity. Numbers of women and men, too, were accused, no matter what their station of life and their former character had been. On the other side, it's alleged that upwards of 50 persons were grievously vexed by the devil and those to whom he had imparted of his power for vile and wicked considerations. But much of malice, distinct, unmistakable personal malice, was mixed up with his accusations. No one can tell. The dire statistics of this time tell us that 55 escaped death by confessing themselves guilty, 150 were in prison, more than 200 accused, and upwards of 20 suffered death. One old man, scorning the accusation and refusing to plead at his trial, was, according to the law, pressed to death for his contumacy. Nay, even dogs were accused of witchcraft, suffered the legal penalties, and are recorded among the subjects of capital punishment. There was no one to try and save Lois. The only person who yearned after her, who would have befriended her if he could, was her cousin Manasseh Hickson. Poor mad Manasseh. But he was so wild and outrageous in his talk that it was all his mother could do to keep his state concealed from public observation. She had given him a sleeping potion, and while he lay heavy and inert under the influence of the poppy tea, his mother bound him with cords to the ponderous antique bed in which he slept, looking heartbroken as she did so, acknowledging the degradation of her firstborn, him of whom she had ever been so proud. Late that evening, Grace Hickson stood in Lois's cell, hooded and cloaked up to her eyes. Her aunt was standing by her for an instant or two in silence before Lois seemed aware of her presence. Suddenly she looked up and uttered a little cry, shrinking away from the dark figure. Then, as if her cry had loosened Grace's tongue, she began, "Lois Berkeley, did I ever do you any harm?" Grace did not know how often her want of loving kindness had pierced the tender heart of the stranger under her roof, nor did Lois remember it against her now. Instead, Lois's memory was filled with grateful thoughts of how much that might have been left undone by a less conscientious person. Her aunt had done for her, and she half stretched out her arms as if to a friend in that desolate place, while she answered, "Oh no, you were very good, very kind." But Grace stood immovable. "I did you no harm, though I never rightly knew why you came to us." "I was sent by my mother on her deathbed," moaned Lois, covering her face. It grew darker every instant. Her aunt stood still and silent. "Does any of mine ever wrong you?" she asked after a time. No, never. Till Prudence said, "Oh, Aunt, do you think I'm a witch?" And now Lois was standing up, holding by Grace's cloak and trying to read her face. Grace drew herself up so little away from the girl, whom she dreaded and yet sought to propitiate. "Wiser than I, godlier than I, have said it. But oh, Lois, it was my firstborn. Loose him from the demon, for the sake of him whose name I dare not name in this terrible building, filled with them who've renounced the hopes of their baptism. Loose Manasseh from his awful state, if ever I or mine did you a kindness." "You asked me for Christ's sake," said Lois. "I can name that holy name, for, oh, Aunt, indeed, and in holy truth, I am no witch, and yet I'm to die, to be hanged. Oh, Aunt, don't let them kill me." I'm so young and never did anyone any harm that I know of. Hush, for very shame. This afternoon I've bound my firstborn with strong cords to keep him from doing himself or us mischief. He's so frenzied. Lois Barclay, look here. And Grace knelt down at her niece's feet and joined her hands as if in prayer. I'm a proud woman. God forgive me. I never thought to kneel to any save to him. And now I kneel at your feet to pray you to release my children, more especially my son Manasseh, from the spells you've put upon them. Lois, hearken to me, and I pray to the Almighty for you, if yet there may be mercy. I cannot do it. I never did you or yours any wrong. How can I undo it? How can I? And she wrung her hands in intensity of conviction of the futility of aught she could do. Here Grace got up slowly, stiffly and sternly. She stood aloof from the chained girl, in the remote corner of the prison cell near the door, ready to make her escape as soon as she had cursed the witch, who would not, or could not, undo the evil she had wrought. Grace lifted up her right hand and held it up on high, as she doomed Lois to be accursed forever for her deadly sin and her want of mercy, even at this final hour. And lastly, she summoned her to meet her at the judgment seat, and answer for this deadly injury done to both souls and bodies of those who had taken her in and received her when she came to them an orphan and a stranger. Until this last summons, Lois had stood as one who hears her sentence and can say nothing against it, for she knows all would be in vain. But she raised her head when she heard her aunt speak of the judgment seat, and at the end of Grace's speech she too lifted up her right hand as if solemnly pledging herself by that action, and replied, Aunt, I will meet you there, and there you will know my innocence of this deadly thing. God have mercy on you and yours. Her calm voice maddened Grace, and making a gesture as if she plucked up a handful of dust from the floor and threw it at Lois, she cried, Witch! Witch! Ask mercy for thyself. I need not your prayers, witches' prayers is read backwards. I spit at you and defy thee. And so she went away. On the Wednesday afternoon they thrust another witch into Lois's cell. Lois, not recognising anything but an old ragged woman lying helpless on her face on the ground, lifted her up, and lo, it was Natty. Dirty, filthy indeed, mud-pelted, stone-beaten, bruised, and all astray in her wits with the treatment she had received from the mob outside. Lois held her in her arms and softly wiped the old brown wrinkled face with her apron, crying over it, as she'd hardly yet cried over her own sorrows. For hours she tended the old woman, tended her bodily woes, and as the poor creature's scattered senses came slowly back, Lois gathered her infinite dread of the morrow, when she too was to be led out to die, in face of all that infuriated crowd. Lois sought in her own mind for some source of comfort for the old woman, who shook like one in the shaking palsy at the dread of death. And such a death! When all was quiet through the prison in the deep, dead midnight, the jailer outside the door heard Lois saying all the blessed words she could remember, comforting the helpless woman, and in comforting her, Lois was comforted. It strengthened her. In strengthening the woman, Lois was strengthened. The morning came, and the summons to come forth and die came. They who entered the cell found Lois asleep, her face resting on the slumbering old woman whose head she still held in her lap. She did not seem clearly to recognize where she was when she awakened. All she appeared to know was that somehow she had to protect this poor woman. She smiled faintly when she saw the bright light of the April day, and putting her arm around Natty, tried to keep her quiet with hushing, soothing words of broken meaning and holy fragments of the Psalms. Natty tightened her hold upon Lois as they drew near the gallows, and the outrageous crowd below began to hoot and yell. Lois redoubled her efforts to calm and encourage Natty, apparently unconscious that any of the opprobrium, the hootings, the stones, the mud, was directed towards her herself. But when they took Natty from her arms and led her out to suffer first, Lois seemed all at once to recover her sense of the present terror. She gazed wildly around, stretched out her arms as if to some person in the distance, who was yet visible to her, and cried out once with a voice that thrilled through all who heard it, "Mother!" Directly afterwards, the body of Lois the witch swung in the air, and everyone stood with hushed breath, with a sudden wonder, like a fear of deadly crime fallen upon them. The stillness and the silence were broken by one crazed and mad who came rushing up the steps of the ladder and caught Lois's body in his arms and kissed her lips with wild passion. And then, as if it were true what the people believed, that he was possessed by a demon, he sprang down and rushed through the crowd, out to the bounds of the city, and out into the dark, dense forest.